how to stop needing closure from people who hurt you. You are not really waiting for closure. You are waiting for the person who hurt you to finally become the kind of person they were, not when it mattered. Honest, brave, aware. Human enough to look you in the eye and say, "Yes, I know what I did." And that is why it still follows you into quiet moments. Not just because they lied, left, betrayed you, used your kindness, dismissed your pain, or disappeared when accountability became uncomfortable. It follows you because some part of you is still sitting beside a phone that may never light up, still replaying a conversation that may never happen, still hoping the same person who created the confusion will one day bring the clarity. And that hope can feel innocent, it can feel mature. It can feel like all you want is one clean sentence. "I should not have treated you that way. You were not crazy. Your pain was real. I was wrong." For a person who has been emotionally drained, manipulated, dismissed, or made to question their own memory, those words can feel like oxygen. You are not asking for luxury. You are asking for the truth. But here is the part that can change your life if you are ready to hear it. If your peace depends on those words, the person who hurt you still has power over the most private room in your mind. They may not be in your house, they may not be in your bed, they may not be on the other end of the line, but if your nervous system still needs their apology before it can rest, they still have access. If your confidence still needs their explanation before it can stand, they still have influence. If your healing still waits for their maturity, then your life is still moving at the speed of their character. That is the hidden trap of needing closure. It can look like healing from the outside. It can sound reasonable when you explain it to a friend. It can even feel dignified because you tell yourself you are not chasing them, you only want understanding. But sometimes what you call closure is still attachment dressed in better language. Sometimes it is the wounded part of you begging the person who confused you to become the source of your clarity. Sometimes it is your pride asking them to admit your value so you can stop doubting it. Sometimes it is your exhausted mind trying to turn an unfair ending into a clean ending because clean pain feels easier to carry than messy pain. And this is where Stoic wisdom becomes deeply practical. Not cold, not detached in a fake way. Practical. The Stoics would not ask you to pretend it did not hurt. They would not ask you to excuse betrayal, deny anger, or act superior while your chest still tightens at their name. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus all understood something modern people forget. The mind can survive pain, but it suffers endlessly when it keeps handing its power to what it cannot control. You cannot control whether they apologize. You cannot control whether they tell the truth. You cannot control whether they ever become mature enough to face what they did. You cannot control whether they feel remorse at night, whether they rewrite the story to protect themselves, or whether they walk around believing they did nothing wrong. But you can control whether you keep living at the door of their silence. You can control whether you keep reopening the wound in your own mind. You can control whether you let their lack of accountability become your permanent identity. And you can control the moment you decide, quietly but firmly, I may never receive the ending I wanted, but I will not let the absence of that ending become the ruler of my life. But this video is not about pretending you no longer care. It is not about acting cold. It is not about sending a dramatic final message, blocking someone out of anger, or convincing yourself that you are above human pain. It is about learning how to stop needing closure from people who hurt you. It is about separating pain from dependence. It is about understanding why their silence keeps pulling you back. It is about seeing why one more message may not give you peace. It is about giving yourself the ending someone else was too weak, too proud, or too emotionally small to give you. And if you stay with this until the end, you will see something most people only understand after losing years of sleep, self-respect, and emotional energy. Closure is not always a conversation. Sometimes it is a boundary. Sometimes it is a decision. Sometimes it is not the door someone opens for you. Sometimes it is the moment you stop standing in front of that door. And the first place that door appears is in the belief that their explanation is the key to your freedom. Stop treating their explanation as the key to your freedom. Before anything else, be honest about the bargain you have been making in silence. You may have told yourself, "I am doing fine." You may show up at work, answer emails, pay bills, take care of family, keep moving like an adult who has no time to fall apart. But somewhere underneath that normal life, one condition remains. I will truly be okay when they explain. That condition is the chain. The first trap is believing your freedom is hidden inside their mouth. You may not say it that way, but that is what your mind is doing when it tells you, if they would just explain it, I could move on. If they would just admit what they did, I could stop replaying it. If they would just apologize, I could finally sleep. If they would just tell me why, my mind would stop searching. It feels reasonable. It feels mature. It feels like you are not asking for much. Just one honest conversation. Just one moment where they stop hiding behind silence, denial, excuses, pride, or emotional distance. And yes, maybe you deserved that. You deserved honesty. You deserved a cleaner ending. You deserved to be spoken to like an adult. You deserved a person brave enough to look at the damage and not run away from it. But life often does not give you what you deserved. It gives you what happened. Then it asks what kind of person you will become in response. That is where Stoicism begins. Not in pretending the wound does not exist. Not in saying it does not matter when it clearly changed you. Not in forcing yourself to forget someone who affected you deeply. Stoicism begins when you stop placing the key to your peace in the hands of someone who already mishandled your trust, because the person who hurt you may not have the character to give you the explanation you are waiting for. They may not have the courage. They may not have the emotional language. They may not have the self-awareness. They may not even want to understand, because understanding would make them responsible. And if your life stops until they become capable of giving you what they lack, then you are not waiting for closure. You are waiting for them to become someone else. That can cost you years. Epictetus would ask you one simple question. Is this within your control? Their apology is not. Their honesty is not. Their remorse is not. Their willingness to see the truth is not. Their ability to admit what they did is not. But your response is. Your boundary is. Your interpretation is. Your next action is. Your refusal to let their silence define your future is. That is where power returns. Most people stay trapped because they keep staring at the wrong side of the line. They think about what the other person should say, should feel, should admit, should understand, and maybe they are right. Maybe the other person should do all of that. But the real question is sharper. How long will you keep your life suspended until they do it? That is the hidden danger of needing closure. It turns your healing into a hostage situation. The other person does not even need to be present anymore. Their absence becomes enough to control you. You check for the message, you imagine the conversation, you rehearse the apology, you picture them finally understanding, and every time you do, your mind mistakes rehearsal for progress. It feels like you are solving the pain, but often you are circling it. Even if they explained themselves, what then? What if the explanation is weak? What if it is selfish? What if it creates 3 more questions? What if they apologize but still avoid responsibility? What if they admit something but not enough? What if the conversation you waited months for cannot carry the emotional weight you placed on it? Many people get the apology and still do not feel free, because the apology was never the whole work. Words can confirm, words can soothe, words can clarify, but words from another person cannot rebuild your self-trust. They cannot restore the nights you lost. They cannot undo the damage. They cannot decide for you that the past no longer gets to govern your future. That part belongs to you. Marcus Aurelius would tell you to return to the ruling part of your mind, the place where judgment is formed and action begins. Not because people are fair, not because the world gives clean endings, but because your inner command cannot be outsourced. So when your mind says, I need them to explain, well, answer, I need to stop abandoning my peace to their silence. And when your mind says, I cannot move on until they admit it, answer, I can acknowledge the truth even if they never do. When your mind says, they owe me closure, answer, maybe they do, but I owe myself freedom. That sentence matters. Maybe they owe you, but you owe yourself. You owe yourself a life that does not kneel in front of an unanswered question. You owe yourself sleep that is not controlled by someone else's emotional cowardice. You owe yourself mornings that do not begin with checking whether they finally became mature. Closure begins when you stop treating their explanation as the missing piece of your soul. It is not. You were whole before they hurt you. You may feel fractured now, but fractured is not your identity. It is a condition that can be healed with time, discipline, truth, boundaries, and the slow return of self-respect. This does not mean a conversation is always wrong. Sometimes clarity is possible. Sometimes a person grows. Sometimes a final exchange can be useful. But you cannot make your freedom dependent on that possibility. You can be open to an apology without waiting for it. You can listen to an explanation without needing it. You can accept accountability if it comes without making your life revolve around its arrival. That is maturity. That is Stoic strength, not closing your heart, not denying pain, not pretending you are above human longing, but learning to say, I wanted an answer, I may never receive it, and still I will not let the absence of that answer become a prison. The key was never in their hands. It was in your ability to stop asking someone else's weakness to become your release. And once you understand that, a harder truth appears. Some people will never give you closure, not because the story is too complicated, but because their character is too small to face what they did. Accept that some people hurt you from a level they will never rise above. This lesson hurts because it forces you to stop negotiating with potential. You are not grieving only what they did. You are grieving the version of them you kept hoping would appear at the last second. The version who would become honest, the version who would finally understand, the version who would meet your pain with both hands instead of dropping it on the floor and walking away. Some people hurt you from a level they may never grow beyond. That sentence hurts because it removes the fantasy. It removes the hope that one day they will wake up, feel the full weight of what they did, and return with a level of honesty that finally calms your mind. Maybe they will, but maybe they will not. And if you are honest, part of you already knows which one is more likely. You have seen how they avoid responsibility. You have seen how they twist facts. You have seen how quickly they defend themselves. You have seen how easily they disappear when accountability enters the room. You have seen how they minimize your pain, then act offended when you name it. You have seen enough, but the wounded mind is stubborn. It keeps saying, maybe if I explain it better, they will understand. Maybe if I show them how deeply it hurt, they will care. Maybe if I find the right words, the right tone, the right moment, they will finally become honest. And that is where many people lose years. They are not only trying to get closure, they are trying to raise the emotional level of someone who may be committed to staying exactly where they are. This does not mean the person is evil. Sometimes people are simply weak. Sometimes they are immature. Sometimes they are afraid of guilt. Sometimes they are selfish. Sometimes they are so attached to their own version of the story that truth feels like humiliation. And sometimes they know exactly what they did. They just do not want to face what it says about them. That is hard to accept because you may want the situation to be more meaningful than it is. You may want a deep, hidden reason, a complicated wound, a secret explanation that makes the person less responsible. Maybe there is a reason, but a reason is not always an excuse. Someone else's wound does not give them the right to become a wound in you. The Stoic does not deny complexity. The Stoic understands that people act from ignorance, fear, pride, appetite, distorted impressions, and self-protection. But once you understand that someone is acting from a low, confused, selfish, or fearful level of perception, you stop expecting them to suddenly speak from wisdom. You stop going to a dry well and calling it hope. That is what needing closure often becomes. You return to someone who has already shown emotional poverty, asking them to produce emotional wealth. You want depth from someone who lives on the surface. You want truth from someone who survives through denial. You want remorse from someone who protects the ego more than the relationship. You want a clean ending from someone who created confusion because confusion served them. And each time they fail to give it, you feel wounded again. But now, part of the wound comes from your expectation. The expectation that your pain should make them mature. The expectation that your loyalty should awaken their conscience. The expectation that if you were hurt badly enough, they would automatically care deeply enough. Sometimes they do not. That is one of the most brutal lessons in human behavior. Your pain does not guarantee another person's growth. Your tears do not guarantee their accountability. Your loyalty does not guarantee their honesty. Your suffering does not force them to become wise. Marcus Aurelius prepared himself to meet selfish, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, and difficult people. He did not do this to become cynical. He did it so their behavior would not control his inner state. Preparation protects peace. When you expect depth from everyone, shallow behavior shocks you. When you understand that many people are ruled by unexamined impulses, their behavior can still hurt, but it no longer surprises you in the same way. There is power in not being surprised, not because you become cold, because you stop bargaining with reality. You begin to say, this is the level they are acting from. Not the level I wanted, not the level I deserved, not the level I imagined, the level they revealed. And behavior reveals more than promises ever will. A person can say they care and still avoid every hard conversation. A person can say they are sorry and still repeat the same wound. A person can say they did not mean it and still refuse to understand the impact. A person can say they want peace, but only if peace means you stop asking for accountability. At some point, you must stop listening only to words and start reading the level of character. That is not bitterness, that is discernment. And adults who have been hurt need discernment more than fantasy. Ask yourself, am I waiting for an explanation, or am I refusing to accept what their behavior has already explained? Because sometimes the explanation is not hidden, it is visible. Their silence is information, their avoidance is information, their defensiveness is information, their lack of remorse is information, their ability to move on without repair is information. Their pattern is information. You may not like the answer, but it is still an answer. Many people cannot narrate their own darkness with honesty. They live inside it, they defend it, they rename it, they call avoidance peace. They call selfishness self-protection. They call cruelty honesty. They call emotional cowardice confusion. They call your pain overreaction. And if you keep waiting for them to use the correct words, you may miss the truth already standing in front of you. You cannot build inner peace on another person's awakening. You can wish them growth. You can hope they become better. You can forgive privately if forgiveness becomes honest and not forced. But you cannot keep your life frozen until their conscience develops enough to meet your pain properly. That is not compassion. That is captivity. The Stoic does not need to hate the person who hurt him. Hatred is still attachment. Resentment is still a way of staying near the wound. Bitterness keeps the past alive under the appearance of strength. The deeper move is cleaner. You see the level. You accept the level. You stop asking that level to rise on your schedule. Then you decide what your own character requires. Maybe distance, maybe silence, maybe one clear boundary, maybe no access, maybe forgiving them without ever returning to the old version of the relationship, maybe admitting that the person you wanted them to be was never the person they consistently showed you. That hurts, but it also frees, because the moment you stop expecting wisdom from someone who has never practiced it, your mind stops organizing itself around their deficiency. You stop asking, why can they not give me what I need? And you start asking, why am I still asking them for something their character cannot carry? That question brings responsibility back where it belongs. Not responsibility for what they did, that belongs to them. Responsibility for what you keep doing with the wound, that belongs to you. Accept that some people hurt you from a level they may never rise above. Do not waste your life trying to pull honesty out of someone who protects themselves with denial. Do not beg for depth from someone who has chosen the surface. Do not confuse your ability to feel deeply with their ability to answer deeply. And once you accept that, another battle begins. Even after you see who they are, your own mind may keep dragging you back to the scene, reopening the same wound in a courtroom no one else is attending. Stop reopening the wound by replaying the trial in your mind. There is a kind of pain that does not need the other person to be present anymore. It knows how to continue by itself. It appears while you are brushing your teeth, while you are sitting in traffic, while you are trying to enjoy dinner, while you're lying beside someone else, pretending your mind is not still standing in an old room with an old conversation. That is when the past becomes more than a memory. It becomes a routine. The event may have happened once, but your mind can make it happen 1,000 times. That is the part that quietly destroys people. Someone hurt you, they lied, left, betrayed, dismissed, disappeared, replaced you, used you, or gave you confusion when you deserved honesty. The moment itself may have lasted one conversation, one message, one decision, one silence. But afterward, your mind built a courtroom, and every night the trial begins again. You replay what they said, then what you said, then what you should have said, then what they should have admitted, then the evidence, then the contradiction, then the imaginary final speech where you explain everything so clearly that they finally understand. For a moment it feels useful, it feels like analysis, it feels like searching for truth. It feels like protecting yourself from being fooled again, but sometimes it is not wisdom anymore. It is self-punishment wearing the mask of investigation. That is the danger of overthinking after someone hurts you. The mind tells you it is solving the pain, but often it is keeping the pain alive by dragging your attention back into the scene. Again, again, again. You become the judge, the witness, the victim, the lawyer, and the prisoner at the same time. They may have left your life physically, but mentally you keep summoning them. That is not closure. It is captivity with a calmer name. Epictetus taught that people are disturbed not only by events but by the judgments they form about events. This does not mean betrayal, abandonment, manipulation, or cruelty are harmless. It means the mind can continue adding pain long after the original moment has passed. There is the wound. Then there is the story you keep pressing into the wound. You must learn the difference. A person leaves. That is the fact. Your mind says, they left because I was not worth staying for. That is an interpretation. A person refuses to apologize. That is the fact. Your mind says, if they do not apologize, my pain must not matter. That is an interpretation. A person gives silence. That is the fact. Your mind says, there must be some hidden answer I have not discovered yet. That is an interpretation. A person acts as if nothing happened. That is the fact. Your mind says, I need to make them feel what I felt before I can be free. That is an interpretation. If you never challenge the interpretation, the wound becomes an identity. This is where people stay trapped, not because the past is still happening, but because the mind keeps treating the past as unfinished business. So it brings the person back. It brings the betrayal back. It brings the humiliation back. It brings the confusion back. Every replay strengthens the emotional pathway inside you. The more you rehearse the wound, the easier it becomes for the mind to return to it. That is why a normal day can suddenly collapse. You hear a song, you see a place, you remember a sentence, you notice a date, someone says their name, and suddenly your body reacts as if the whole thing is happening again. That is not weakness, that is conditioning. Your mind has practiced the wound so often that it has become familiar territory. But familiar does not mean healthy. A prison can become familiar too. Marcus Aurelius returned again and again to the present action, not because memory has no value, but because life is only available now. The past can teach, but it cannot be lived again. When you keep returning to it emotionally, you abandon the only place where power exists. Right now. This thought, this breath, this next choice. That is where freedom rebuilds itself. When the replay starts, do not panic. Do not tell yourself, I should not be thinking about this, because that often makes the thought louder. Instead, interrupt it with reason. Ask, is this giving me wisdom, or is it dragging me back into the same pain? That question matters. Not every memory is useless. Reflection can be necessary. You need to see the pattern. You need to recognize where they manipulated you, where you ignored yourself, where your hope became stronger than your discernment, where your boundaries were too negotiable. Reflection produces clarity. Rumination produces exhaustion. Reflection has an ending. Rumination has a loop. Reflection says, here is the lesson. Rumination says, run it again. Reflection returns you to life. Rumination keeps you in the courtroom. A simple test is this. After thinking about it, do you feel clearer or more trapped? If you feel clearer, there may be wisdom there. If you feel more trapped, you are probably feeding the wound. Sometimes you must be firm with your own mind, not cruel. Firm. Say, I have already examined this. Say, I know what happened. Say, I do not need to reopen this tonight. Say, this thought is familiar, but it is not useful. Say, I can learn from the past without living inside it. That is not denial, that is leadership. Your mind needs leadership after pain, because pain can become repetitive. It asks the same questions because those questions feel like connection. If you are still asking why, still replaying, still imagining, still arguing internally, part of you still feels close to the person, even if the closeness hurts. That is why the replay becomes addictive. It keeps them present. It gives the illusion that the relationship, the bond, the conflict, the unfinished emotional thread is still active. If you stop replaying it, you may have to face the emptiness underneath. That is hard. The mind would rather suffer with a familiar ghost than sit quietly with absence. But the Stoic path asks for courage here, the courage to let the mental trial end, not because they were innocent, not because your pain does not matter, but because you should not keep attending the same trial for a person who is no longer showing up. Think about that. You are still in court. They are not. You are still presenting evidence. They are not listening. So who is being punished now? Not them. You. That realization can hurt, but it can also wake you up. At some point, you must stop using your own mind as the place where the person who hurt you continues to have access. You may not control whether memories appear, but you can control whether you turn every memory into a full investigation. You can control whether you feed the thought. You can control whether you build your whole evening around a person who already took enough from you. This is discipline. It looks ordinary. Closing the notes app when you want to write the message. Getting out of bed when your mind wants to spiral. Walking instead of rereading old texts. Breathing through the urge to create another confrontation. Saying, "Not tonight," to the same thought you have entertained for months. Small refusals rebuild command. Bring the mind back to what is real. What happened? What did it reveal? What boundary is needed? What lesson must I keep? What action belongs to today? Fact, lesson, boundary, action. That is the Stoic sequence, not endless trial, not emotional theater. Fact, lesson, boundary, action. Maybe you know enough. You know they hurt you. You know they avoided responsibility. You know how your body felt around them. You know what the pattern did to your peace. You know what it cost you to keep hoping. Maybe the missing detail is not the key. Maybe it is just another doorway back into the same room. Stop reopening the wound by replaying the trial in your mind. You are allowed to learn from what happened. You are allowed to grieve. You are allowed to feel anger, sadness, confusion, and disappointment. But you are not required to keep reliving the same scene as proof that it mattered. It mattered. Now let it teach you. Then let it stop ruling you, because the next part of closure is even deeper. Sometimes you are not really waiting for an explanation. You are waiting for the person who hurt you to validate that your pain was real. Separate the pain from the need to be validated by the person who caused it. This is where the wound becomes personal in a deeper way. Because maybe the hardest part was not only what they did, maybe the hardest part was watching them act calm afterward. Watching them sleep, smile, post, work, date, laugh, move through the world as if they had not left something heavy inside you. That kind of indifference can make a person question reality. Sometimes what you call closure is not about information. It is about validation. You want them to say it. You want them to admit, clearly, without twisting the story, without making excuses, without turning themselves into the victim, that they hurt you. You want to hear, "Yes, I did that. Yes, it was wrong. Yes, your pain makes sense. Yes, I understand why it damaged you." There is nothing strange about wanting that. When someone hurts you and then acts as if nothing happened, the wound becomes heavier. Not only because of the original pain, but because of the denial that follows it. The silence, the indifference, the minimization, the casual way they continue living while you are still trying to understand what collapsed inside you. That can feel almost insulting, as if the wound itself was not enough. Now you also have to fight for the right to say it was a wound. This is why people get trapped. They are not only waiting for an explanation, they are waiting for the person who caused the pain to confirm that the pain was real. But your pain does not become real only when they admit it. It was real when you felt it. It was real when you lost sleep. It was real when your body tightened at their name. It was real when you started doubting your own judgment. It was real when you replayed conversations, searching for the moment where things changed. It was real when you realized you were carrying something they seemed able to put down. Their refusal to validate it does not erase it. Their silence does not make it imaginary. Their denial does not make you dramatic. Their emotional immaturity does not get to decide whether your experience happened. Many people have been trained to distrust their own pain unless someone else confirms it. They think, if they do not admit it, maybe I exaggerated. If they do not apologize, maybe it was not that bad. If they moved on easily, maybe I am the problem for still hurting. That is how self-doubt grows around the wound. Sometimes the person who hurt you knows this. They know that if they stay vague enough, you may keep questioning yourself. If they deny enough, you may start softening your own memory. If they act calm enough, you may begin wondering if your pain was too much. If they call you sensitive, dramatic, bitter, unstable, or unable to let go, you may start putting your own experience on trial. That is a dangerous place to live, because now the harm has two layers. First, what they did. Second, the way you learn to doubt yourself afterward. The Stoic path asks you to return to what is within your authority. You do not control whether they validate your pain. You do not control whether they tell the truth. You do not control whether they have enough courage to face the damage, but you do control whether you abandon your own perception just because they refuse to honor it. Another person's judgment is not the final measure of reality. A guilty person may call himself innocent. A selfish person may call himself misunderstood. A cruel person may call himself honest. A coward may call his silence peace. Their interpretation is not automatically truth. This matters because closure often becomes a desperate attempt to make the other person say what your own mind needs to say first. You want them to say, "It hurt you," but you can say, "It hurt me." You want them to say, "It was wrong," but you can say, "It was wrong." You want them to say, "You did not deserve that," but you can say, "I did not deserve that." At first, it may not feel as satisfying. Of course, it would feel powerful to hear it from them. Of course, it would bring relief if the person who hurt you became honest enough to stop hiding. Of course, an apology can matter, but your healing cannot require their confession, because if it does, they remain the judge, they remain the witness, they remain the authority, they remain the one who gets to decide when your pain becomes legitimate. That is too much power to give to someone who already mishandled you. You are allowed to name what happened without waiting for the other person to sign the statement. That is not bitterness, that is clarity, but clarity must be honest. Pain can distort perception too. A disciplined person still examines himself. He asks, what part of this is fact? What part is interpretation? What did they do? What did I assume? Where did I ignore reality? Where did I allow too much access? This is not to excuse them. It is to keep you rooted in truth. Real healing requires truth, not just comfort. You do not need to exaggerate what happened in order to justify leaving. You do not need to make them a monster in order to admit they hurt you. You do not need to prove the pain to every person who asks. You only need to see clearly enough to act wisely. There is a sentence that can save you from years of begging for validation. I know what I lived, not as a weapon, as grounding. I know what I lived. I know how I felt around them. I know what changed in me. I know what patterns repeated. I know what I kept excusing. I know what I was afraid to admit. I know how much energy I spent trying to make the situation kinder than it was. That kind of knowing does not need to be loud. It only needs to be strong enough to stop you from crawling back into confusion. Sometimes the person who hurt you will offer a version of the story that protects them completely. They will make it seem mutual when it was not. They will make your reaction the issue instead of their behavior. They will say they never intended harm, as if impact disappears when intention sounds clean. If you still need their validation, you may accept a false version just to feel closer to peace. Do not do that. Peace built on self-betrayal is not peace. It is a quieter wound. The Stoics valued truth because truth is the ground of freedom. You cannot be free while participating in a lie that makes your pain smaller than it was. You also cannot be free if you inflate pain into identity. So take the middle path. Name the truth. Accept the lesson. Remove the expectation that the person who caused the wound must also become the person who validates it. That is inner authority. Inner authority sounds like this. I do not need you to admit it for me to stop denying it. I do not need you to understand it for me to learn from it. I do not need you to feel guilty for me to protect myself. I do not need you to say it mattered for me to stop acting like it did not. That is not coldness, that is self-respect. You may still grieve the apology you never received. You may grieve the version of them you hoped would appear. You may grieve the fact that someone you trusted could not meet you with honesty when honesty mattered most. Let yourself grieve that. Stoicism is not the refusal to feel. It is the refusal to let feeling become a tyrant. Separate the pain from the need to be validated by the person who caused it. Your pain is real even if they deny it. Your healing can begin even if they never say the words you deserved to hear. Do not hand the truth of your wound to someone who benefits from making it smaller. Hold the truth yourself, not with bitterness, with steadiness. And once you do that, you become ready for the next lesson, because sometimes the answer you are waiting for is already there. It is not in their apology, it is in their silence. That their silence is also an answer. Silence is especially dangerous when you still love the possibility of who they could be, because a clear answer forces you to grieve. Silence lets you imagine. It lets you keep building a better version of them inside your own mind, a version who is secretly sorry, secretly struggling, secretly preparing the words you deserved to hear. But imagined remorse cannot hold you at night. Silence can be cruel because it gives your imagination too much room. When someone refuses to explain themselves, your mind tries to fill the empty space. Maybe they feel guilty. Maybe they are confused. Maybe they are waiting for the right time. Maybe they do not know how to say it. Maybe they still care, but they are afraid. Maybe they will come back. Maybe they will finally understand. Maybe. And with every maybe, the wound stays open. That is one of the most dangerous parts of silence after someone hurts you. Silence does not only hurt because it withholds words. It hurts because it creates a blank screen where your anxiety can project whatever it wants: hope, fear, fantasy, excuses, imaginary remorse, imaginary conversations, imaginary endings. If you are not disciplined, you can spend months interpreting silence as if it were a hidden message instead of a visible behavior. But the Stoic mind asks you to observe reality as it is, not as your attachment wishes it would be, not as loneliness hopes it could be, not as memory keeps decorating it. Reality. And reality may be saying something simple. They are not giving clarity. That is information. They are not taking responsibility. That is information. They are not coming forward with honesty. That is information. They are comfortable leaving you confused. That is information. It may not be the answer you wanted, but it is still an answer. Most people do not want to treat silence as an answer because silence feels unfinished. It feels like a pause, not a conclusion. It feels like a door left open, not a door closed. It feels as if something might still happen. Something might still be said. Something might still return and rearrange the whole story. So the mind waits. It checks the phone. It rereads old messages. It studies small signs: a view, a like, a delayed response, a post, a mutual friend's comment, a date that still means something to you, even if it means nothing to them anymore. Every little sign becomes fuel. Not because it contains clarity, but because a mind hungry for closure can turn almost anything into evidence that the story is not over. That is why silence must be handled carefully. Silence can become a drug for the anxious mind. You keep returning to it, hoping it will reveal something new. Most of the time, it only gives you more space to hurt yourself with interpretation. The Stoic practice is to strip things down. Do not romanticize the silence. Do not dramatize it. Do not turn it into a secret confession. Do not call it confusion if it has become a pattern. Ask plainly, what is this behavior showing me? Not what could it mean if they are secretly wounded. Not what could it mean if they are too proud to speak. Not what could it mean if they still care in some hidden way. What is it showing me? If someone repeatedly refuses to give clarity, the behavior shows avoidance. If someone disappears when accountability is required, the behavior shows emotional weakness. If someone only returns when you stop chasing, the behavior shows control, not care. If someone leaves you to carry confusion alone, the behavior shows that your peace is not their priority. That hurts, but it is cleaner than fantasy. Clean pain is better than confusing hope. Clean pain says, this is what happened. Confusing hope says, maybe it will become something else if I wait long enough. The Stoic does not build a life around maybe. The Stoic studies what is. Silence does not always mean someone does not care. Human beings are complicated. Some people freeze. Some people are ashamed. Some people do not know how to speak when guilt enters the room. But Stoicism is not about reading minds. It is about governing your own mind. You do not need to know every hidden motive to make a wise decision. You can make decisions based on patterns. You do not need to prove they are cruel. You do not need to prove they never cared. You do not need to know the secret machinery behind their silence. You only need to ask, what does this pattern do to my peace? What does it require me to tolerate? What kind of person do I become when I keep waiting here? Is this silence asking me to remain loyal to confusion? Those questions return you to what matters. Closure is not about knowing every hidden motive inside another person. Closure is about knowing enough to choose your next step with dignity. And sometimes enough is much less than the anxious mind demands. You know they hurt you. You know they avoided clarity. You know you waited. You know the waiting became a second wound. You know your mind became organized around their absence. You know peace did not grow there. Maybe that is enough. Maybe the silence already told you what the explanation would have tried to hide. This is one of the hardest forms of acceptance. Not dramatic acceptance, a quieter kind. The kind where you stop checking, stop decoding, stop making excuses, stop turning absence into mystery. You say, this silence is information, not revenge. Not bitterness, information. Information tells you where not to keep placing your hope. It tells you where your boundaries must become stronger. It tells you where your nervous system has been waiting for someone else's courage. Waiting for closure from someone's silence is living in an imagined future. You are not living in what is happening. You are living in what might be said someday. But someday is not a place you can stand. Today is. Today you can decide that silence does not get unlimited access to your mind. You can decide not to check, not to decode, not to ask mutual friends, not to build a theory around every small sign, not to treat a lack of response as a puzzle you must solve before you are allowed to heal. This is discipline. It may feel cold at first. It is not cold. It is protective. Every time you interpret silence as possibility, you may be reopening a door reality has already closed. You deserve better than standing at a closed door with your ear pressed against it, waiting for a sound. Understand that their silence is also an answer. It may be incomplete, it may be painful, it may not satisfy the part of you that still wants confession, but it tells you something. It tells you what they are willing to face. It tells you what they are willing to avoid. It tells you how much clarity they are prepared to offer. When you accept silence as information, you stop feeding the fantasy that one perfect explanation is still waiting beyond your reach. You stop treating absence as mystery. You start treating it as reality. And reality, even when it hurts, is safer than illusion. But even after you accept the silence, another trap remains. You may still feel anger, longing, sadness, curiosity, a pull toward the past. And if you are not careful, you will mistake those unfinished feelings for unfinished business. Stop confusing unfinished feelings with unfinished business. There will be days when the body disagrees with the decision your mind already made. You may know the relationship, friendship, family bond, or emotional connection is no longer healthy. You may know the pattern. You may know going back would cost you peace. And still, some ordinary sound, date, smell, place, or memory can pull a feeling out of you before you have time to defend yourself. That does not mean you should return. Just because you still feel something does not mean there is something left to do with them. That is a sentence most wounded people do not want to hear, because the feeling feels like evidence. You miss them, so maybe you should reach out. You feel anger, so maybe you need one more confrontation. You feel curiosity, so maybe there is still something to discover. You feel sadness, so maybe the story is not over. You feel the old pull, the old ache, the old need to understand, and your mind says, this must mean there is unfinished business. But not every unfinished feeling is unfinished business. Sometimes it is grief. Sometimes it is attachment leaving the body slowly. Sometimes it is the nervous system reaching for what was familiar, even if what was familiar hurt. Sometimes it is the echo of a bond already broken. Sometimes the feeling is real, but the action it suggests would be wrong for your peace. That is where Stoic discipline becomes necessary. Emotion is not an order. A feeling can visit you without becoming your commander. You can feel sadness and not return. You can feel anger and not attack. You can feel longing and not reopen the door. You can feel curiosity and not investigate. You can feel the need to explain and still remain silent. This is not emotional suppression. This is emotional leadership. Suppression says, I do not feel this. Leadership says, I feel this, but I will not let it drive me back into a place that wounded me. That difference is the beginning of freedom. Most people suffer because they treat every emotion as a message requiring immediate action. They feel anxiety, so they check. They feel longing, so they text. They feel anger, so they write the paragraph. They feel rejected, so they try to be seen again. They feel uncertain, so they chase clarity from the same person who created confusion. That is how old wounds become active cycles, not because the person is still doing something, but because your feelings keep sending you back to the same source of pain. The Stoics would tell you to pause before obeying the impulse. An impression appears in the mind, a memory, a desire, a fear, a sentence, a possible message. You do not have to agree with it immediately. You can examine it, you can test it, you can ask whether it belongs to wisdom or merely to habit. A memory appears. The mind says, maybe I should message them. You ask, is this reason or is this emotional withdrawal? The mind says, I need to know if they ever cared. You ask, will their answer heal me or will it give me a new wound to interpret? The mind says, I cannot leave it like this. You ask, Is there truly something to resolve, or am I struggling to accept that it ended without fairness? That last question is hard, because sometimes the thing that feels unfinished is not the relationship. It is your expectation that endings should be clean, that people who hurt you should explain themselves, that pain should be followed by justice, that love should be followed by honesty, that betrayal should be followed by remorse. In a better world, maybe it would be that way. But Stoicism does not train you for an ideal world, it trains you for reality. And reality often leaves things uneven. People leave without explaining, people hurt without repairing, people benefit from your kindness and still act careless with your heart. People make a mess and walk away from it. People choose comfort over truth. That is painful. But pain does not automatically mean there is more to do. Sometimes pain means there is more to feel without turning feeling into action. This is one of the hardest skills in emotional maturity, letting a feeling move through you without building a life around it. You can sit with grief. You can breathe through anger. You can notice longing. You can admit, part of me still wants the answer. You can admit, part of me still misses the version I thought they were. And then you can still choose not to go back. That is not weakness. That is command. Marcus Aurelius understood that the mind can be pulled in every direction by memory, fear, desire, resentment, and imagination. The disciplined person does not pretend these forces do not exist. He refuses to let them steal the present action. So when unfinished feelings come, return to the present. What is the action required now? Not what would satisfy the wound for 5 minutes. Not what would create another conversation. Not what would give anxiety temporary relief. What is the action required by wisdom now? Maybe it is silence. Maybe it is sleep. Maybe it is walking outside instead of rereading old messages. Maybe it is writing the truth in a journal and not sending it. Maybe it is calling a friend who brings peace instead of someone who keeps the story alive. Maybe it is cleaning your space, moving your body, returning to work, eating something, or sitting still until the wave passes. The action may look ordinary, but ordinary actions rebuild a disordered life. Closure is not always dramatic. Sometimes closure is not sending the text. Sometimes closure is getting through one evening without reopening the wound. Sometimes closure is not checking their profile. Sometimes closure is not asking someone else about them. Sometimes closure is allowing sadness to exist without turning it into a reason to surrender your progress. That is how emotional discipline is built. Small refusals, small returns, small moments where the old impulse rises and you do not obey. What you feed becomes stronger. If every time you feel longing, you check on them, longing learns that it controls your hands. If every time you feel anger, you rehearse the argument, anger learns that it controls your attention. If every time you feel uncertainty, you search for signs, uncertainty learns that it controls your focus. If every time you feel pain, you return to the person who caused it, pain learns that it controls your direction. But if you feel the emotion and stay loyal to your peace, something different happens. The emotion still comes, but it no longer rules. It becomes weather, not law. A storm can pass through the sky without becoming the sky itself. A feeling can pass through your body without becoming your decision. You must practice this, especially at night, when you are tired, when something reminds you of them, when your pride wants justice and your heart wants proof that you mattered. Those are the dangerous moments, not because you are weak, because the mind is more vulnerable when the body is exhausted and the wound is familiar. Prepare before the urge comes. I will not contact them when I am emotionally flooded. I will not treat loneliness as evidence that I should return. I will not confuse missing someone with needing them. I will not use anger as permission to reopen a closed door. I will not let curiosity drag me back into confusion. These are guardrails. People healing from emotional injury need guardrails. Pain can sound like truth. Pain can imitate intuition, but not every strong feeling is wisdom. Sometimes it is an old attachment asking for one more chance to harm you. You can honor the feeling without obeying it. This is not easy. There will be days when one part of you knows the truth and another part wants the old pattern. One part says, keep walking. Another says, just one message. One part sees the damage clearly, another remembers only the good. That inner conflict does not mean you are failing. It means you are separating from attachment. Separation often feels like contradiction before it feels like freedom. Be patient with that. Do not shame yourself for still feeling. You are human. The body sometimes grieves slower than the mind accepts. But do not use that delay as a reason to reverse your progress. Let the emotions catch up while you keep choosing wisely. Stop confusing unfinished feelings with unfinished business. Just because you still hurt does not mean you should return. Just because you still wonder does not mean you should ask. Just because you still miss them does not mean they are meant to be back in your life. Sometimes the business is finished. The feelings are simply still leaving. Let them leave without reopening the door. Because once you stop treating every emotion as a command, another illusion begins to break. The fantasy that one final conversation would fix everything. And that fantasy may be one of the strongest chains of all. Let go of the fantasy that the final conversation would fix everything. The final conversation is powerful because it feels like a movie scene your pain keeps directing. Everything is finally said. Nothing is interrupted. Nobody gets defensive. The person who hurt you suddenly has the emotional intelligence they never showed before. They understand the timeline. They understand the wound. They understand the cost, and you walk away lighter. That imagined scene can become addictive. So there is a conversation your mind keeps writing. You know the scene. They finally reach out. They finally stop avoiding. They finally explain what happened with honesty. They finally admit they were wrong. They finally say the words you needed when everything was still raw. They look different in this imagined conversation, more mature, more awake, more careful with your pain. They do not interrupt, they do not deny, they do not twist the story, they do not call you dramatic, they do not hide behind confusion, pride, or half-truths. They listen, they understand, they apologize, and in your imagination, something inside you finally rests. That is the fantasy. Sometimes it becomes more addictive than the person, because the fantasy is not only about them, it is about a version of life where pain becomes clean, betrayal becomes understandable, confusion becomes organized. The person who hurt you also becomes the person who gives the wound a meaningful ending. But real life is not always that generous. Sometimes the final conversation you imagine would not heal you. Sometimes it would injure you again. That is difficult to accept because the mind wants the story to end with clarity. It wants the last scene to make sense. It wants the person to speak in a way that proves your suffering was seen, your loyalty was not foolish, your pain was not invisible. But what if the conversation happened and they still avoided responsibility? What if they explained everything in a way that protected only themselves? What if they apologized with words but not truth? What if they said, "I am sorry you feel that way," and your heart felt the wound reopen? What if they blamed timing, stress, confusion, fear, childhood, pressure, or circumstances, but never said, "I chose this and it hurt you"? What if the final conversation gave you more material to overthink? That is the danger. The mind imagines closure as a clean room, but many final conversations are messy rooms with more doors. One answer creates 3 more questions. One apology reveals a hidden lie. One explanation exposes something colder than you expected. One conversation reminds you why your peace was damaged in the first place. Then you leave, not with closure, but with another wound to interpret. The Stoic learns to question desire before obeying it. Wanting the final conversation does not make you weak, it makes you human. But you must ask whether the desire belongs to reason or attachment, whether it leads to freedom or another dependence, whether it brings you closer to dignity or pulls you back into a cycle your wiser mind already knows is finished. Do you want the conversation because it is truly necessary? Or do you want it because part of you still believes they hold the power to give your story dignity? Your story already has dignity. Even without their explanation, even without their apology, even without their maturity, even without the scene where everything is finally spoken in the right order. A painful ending is still an ending. An unfair ending is still an ending. A confusing ending is still an ending. It may not satisfy your heart. It may leave loose threads, but life is full of loose threads, and wisdom often begins when you stop trying to tie them all to the person who kept cutting them. The fantasy of the final conversation is strong because it allows you to keep believing in a version of them that may not exist. In the fantasy they are honest, in the fantasy they understand, in the fantasy they regret the damage, in the fantasy they are finally capable of meeting your pain with maturity. As long as that fantasy stays alive, part of you can avoid grieving the truth. The truth that they may not be that person. The truth that they may never speak with the depth you need. The truth that they may prefer their self-image over your healing. The truth that the ending may stay incomplete if you keep waiting for them to complete it. Marcus Aurelius would tell you to strip the situation down, remove the decoration, remove the emotional perfume, remove the imagined scene. What is the fact? Maybe the fact is they hurt you and did not repair it. Maybe the fact is they had time to speak and chose not to. Maybe the fact is when they did speak, they made you more confused. Maybe the fact is their pattern has already shown you what another conversation is likely to become. Maybe the fact is the person you want closure from is the same person who created the need for closure. Sit with that. Not to become bitter. To become clear. Sometimes you are asking the fire to explain why it burned you while still standing inside the flames. You do not need the fire to become compassionate before you step away. You need to step away because it burns. That is enough. The fantasy says, if I could just speak to them one more time, I would be free. Reason asks, what evidence do I have that one more conversation would create freedom instead of more attachment? The fantasy says, maybe they will finally understand. Reason asks, have they shown the character required for that? The fantasy says, I need them to know how much they hurt me. Reason asks, do I need them to know, or do I need to stop denying what I know? The fantasy says, I cannot leave the story like this. Reason asks, am I leaving the story, or am I refusing to keep suffering inside it? These questions return you to the part of you that can still choose. There are times when a final conversation is appropriate. Stoicism is not avoidance. There are relationships, families, marriages, friendships, and long histories where honest conversation may be necessary. But the issue is not whether conversation is always wrong. The issue is whether you are making conversation into salvation. One conversation can clarify facts. It cannot replace self-respect. One apology can soften pain. It cannot do your inner work for you. One admission can confirm what you lived. It cannot restore the years you spent waiting. One explanation can give context. It cannot turn an unsafe person into a safe one. A conversation is a tool. It is not a throne. Do not place it above your own reason. Before seeking the final conversation, ask, what am I hoping this will give me? Have they shown they are capable of giving that? Am I seeking truth or temporary relief? Am I prepared for the possibility that their answer may hurt more than their silence? Will this serve my healing or reopen my attachment? Desperation can disguise itself as courage. Sometimes you tell yourself, I just need to be brave and say how I feel. Maybe. But sometimes the braver thing is not to speak. Sometimes courage is letting the conversation remain unwritten because you finally understand your peace cannot depend on a scene that requires their transformation. Self-respect often becomes quiet. It says, I already know enough to stop returning. It says, I do not need one more wound to prove the first one was real. It says, I can leave without a perfect ending. It says, the final conversation I imagined may never exist and I will still choose my life. That is strength. Let go of the fantasy that the final conversation would fix everything. Maybe the conversation would help. Maybe it would not. But your freedom cannot depend on a perfect version of someone who has already shown you an imperfect pattern. You can grieve the conversation you wanted. You can grieve the apology that never came. You can grieve the fact that the ending was not worthy of what you gave. But do not confuse grief with instruction. Grief says, this hurt. Wisdom says, do not keep returning to what keeps hurting you. And once that illusion breaks, something else becomes possible. You can stop using the wound as proof that you are broken. You can begin using it as evidence of what must change, evidence of what you must never ignore again, evidence of the boundaries, discernment, and self-command your future will require. Use the wound as evidence, not as identity. Pain has a way of speaking in your own voice. That is why you have to be careful. It may sound like truth when it says, you are hard to love, easy to abandon, foolish for trusting, too much, not enough, too sensitive, too late, too damaged. But pain is not always honest. Sometimes pain is just loud. What happened to you is evidence. It is not your identity. That distinction matters because pain has a strange way of trying to rename you. Someone leaves, and the mind says, I am abandoned. Someone lies, and the mind says, I am foolish for trusting. Someone chooses someone else, and the mind says, I was not enough. Someone uses you, and the mind says, I am easy to use. Someone refuses to apologize, and the mind says, my pain must not matter. This is how a wound becomes a name. And once a wound becomes a name, you stop seeing it as something that happened. You begin seeing it as who you are. That is dangerous, because if you become the wound, every new situation passes through that wound. Every silence feels like rejection. Every delay feels like abandonment. Every disagreement feels like proof that love is unsafe. Every boundary from another person feels like punishment. You stop responding to the present. You start defending yourself against the past. And the past wins without even being present. This is one hidden reason people keep needing closure. They are not only trying to understand what happened, they are trying to escape the identity the pain created inside them. They want the person who hurt them to say something that cancels the false name. You are not foolish. You are not unlovable. You are not easy to replace. You are not the problem. You did matter. It would feel relieving to hear those words. But you cannot let the person who wounded you become the one who defines you back into wholeness. That is too much authority. Your identity must return to your own hands. The Stoics understood that external events can touch the body, reputation, plans, relationships, and circumstances, but they do not have the final right to define the inner character. Marcus Aurelius lived surrounded by betrayal, pressure, grief, illness, and instability. Yet, he kept returning to one question. What does this moment ask of my character? Not, what does this prove about my worth? Not, how do I make the world admit I suffered? Not, how do I force people to see me correctly? But what kind of person must I become now? That question changes everything. When you ask, what does this prove about me? Pain often answers with cruelty. When you ask, what does this require from me? Wisdom begins to speak. Maybe it requires discernment, maybe stronger boundaries, maybe patience with your own healing, maybe admitting that you ignored signs because hope was louder than reason, maybe grieving the version of someone you wanted to believe in, maybe learning not to confuse intensity with love, access with intimacy, attention with respect, or apology with transformation. That is evidence. That is useful. The wound can show you where you were too open, where you trusted words without observing patterns, where you explained away behavior that deserved attention, where you gave chances to someone who used chances as more room to harm you. But if you are not careful, you will turn those lessons into self-hatred. I should have known. I was stupid. I let this happen. I always choose wrong. I cannot trust myself. Stop. That is not wisdom. That is pain pretending to be analysis. There is a difference between responsibility and self-condemnation. Responsibility says, I will learn from what I allowed, ignored, or misunderstood. Self-condemnation says, I am defective because I was hurt. Responsibility gives you power. Self-condemnation gives the past another weapon. The Stoic path is not to shame yourself for being wounded. It is to become more awake because of what the wound revealed. Seneca understood adversity as a test of the soul, not because suffering is good in itself, but because difficulty reveals where strength must be built. Pain exposes what comfort hides. Betrayal exposes where trust needs wisdom. Loss exposes where attachment became dependence. Silence exposes where you were giving too much power to someone else's response. So ask honestly, what did this wound reveal? Not as accusation, as training. Did it reveal that you abandon yourself when someone pulls away? Did it reveal that you chase explanations when silence appears? Did it reveal that you confuse someone's potential with their pattern? Did it reveal that you give people access before they prove character? Did it reveal that you keep trying to be chosen by people who make you feel small? Did it reveal that you make another person's apology the condition of your peace? These are not reasons to hate yourself. These are places to become stronger. The wound can become a map. It can show where your boundaries were weak, where your standards became negotiable, where your hunger for love made you tolerate confusion, where you kept explaining pain to someone who benefited from not understanding it. Do not waste that evidence, but do not turn it into a life sentence. Do not say, I will never trust again. That is fear. Do not say, everyone leaves. That is a wound generalizing itself. Do not say, I am better alone forever. That may sound strong, but sometimes it is grief wearing armor. The Stoic does not use pain to become unreachable. He uses pain to become wiser. There is a difference. Unreachable means the wound is still in command. Wiser means reason has returned. You can become more careful without becoming cold, more selective without becoming cruel, more private without becoming isolated, stronger without becoming hard in the wrong places. Pain wants extremes. Wisdom chooses proportion. If someone betrayed you, the lesson is not that trust is foolish. The lesson is that trust should be given with observation, not desperation. If someone abandoned you, the lesson is not that you are unworthy. The lesson is that your worth cannot depend on someone's capacity to stay. If someone manipulated you, the lesson is not that kindness is weakness. The lesson is that kindness needs boundaries. If someone never gave closure, the lesson is not that your pain was meaningless. The lesson is that your peace must not depend on another person's emotional courage. This is how you turn the wound into evidence. You examine it without worshipping it. You learn from it without becoming it. You remember it without letting it rule every future door. When your mind says, "This always happens to me," correct it. When it says, "I am the kind of person people leave," correct it. When it says, "I was not enough," correct it. Say, "This happened to me. It is not me." Say, "I was hurt. I am not the wound." Say, "I was deceived. I am learning discernment." Say, "I was abandoned. I am returning to myself." That is mental governance. Your mind will either be governed by injury or governed by reason. If you do not consciously shape the meaning of what happened, the wound will shape it for you. The wound alone teaches fear. Reason turns the wound into wisdom. Use the wound as evidence, not as identity. Let it teach you what to see sooner. Let it teach you what to stop excusing. Let it teach you where your peace must be protected. But do not let it rename you. You are not the betrayal. You are not the abandonment. You are not the silence. You are not the unanswered question. You are the person learning how not to live from it. And once you understand that, the next lesson becomes practical. There will come a moment when the old impulse returns. You will want to send the message. You will want to ask one more question. You will want to reopen the door. And that moment will test whether your closure is real or still dependent on their response. Practice the discipline of not sending the message. This is where the philosophy becomes brutally real, not in a book, not in a quote, not in a calm moment where everything makes sense. It happens when the message is already typed, your thumb is close to send, and your whole body is begging for the relief of being heard. That is the battlefield. There will be a moment when your closure is tested. It will not look dramatic from the outside. No one may see it. No one may know it is happening. You may be alone in your room, sitting in your car, lying in bed, standing in the kitchen, staring at your phone with a message already written. One paragraph, one question, one final attempt, one sentence that says, "I just need to understand." And in that moment, the whole past presses against your chest. The memories, the anger, the injustice, the confusion, the need to be heard, the old hope that maybe this time they will answer differently. Your mind will try to convince you that sending the message is not weakness. It will say, "This is closure." It will say, "You deserve to speak." It will say, "You have held this in long enough." It will say, "Maybe this will finally end it." Maybe. But ask a harder question. Do I want to send this because wisdom requires it or because anxiety wants relief? That question can save you. Not every message is communication. Some messages are withdrawal symptoms. Some messages are attempts to reopen access. Some messages are disguised begging. Some messages are anger, looking for somewhere to land. Some messages are loneliness, trying to turn back into connection. Some messages are pain, trying to make the other person feel responsible enough for you to feel seen. The problem is not that you have something to say. Maybe you do. Maybe your words are valid. Maybe your pain is real. Maybe they deserve to hear the truth. The problem is when you send the message from a place where your peace depends on their response. Then the message is not freedom. It is another chain. You send it, and what happens? You wait. You check. You interpret the delay. You wonder if they read it. You wonder why they have not answered. You wonder if the answer is cold because they do not care. You wonder if the answer is warm because maybe they still care. You wonder if silence means guilt, indifference, confusion, control, avoidance, or punishment. Now you are back in the same prison. Only this time, you walked in with your own hands. That is why the discipline of not sending the message is not small. It is a major act of self-command. Epictetus would remind you that freedom begins when you stop being ruled by what is outside your control. A message sent to someone who has already shown confusion, avoidance, manipulation, or emotional weakness places your nervous system back in the territory of what you cannot control. You cannot control how they read it. You cannot control whether they answer. You cannot control whether they understand. You cannot control whether they twist it. You cannot control whether they use your vulnerability against you. You cannot control whether they give you warmth for one day and confusion for another month, but you can control whether you hand them the opening. Do not confuse this with silence born from fear. There is cowardly silence, and there is disciplined silence. Cowardly silence avoids truth because it is afraid of discomfort. Disciplined silence recognizes that truth has already been seen, and speaking again would only reopen a door reason has already closed. If you are silent because you are afraid to be honest with yourself, that is not strength. But if you are silent because you have already spoken, already tried, already explained, already waited, already watched the pattern repeat, and now you choose peace over another cycle, that is strength. A powerful person does not speak every time pain asks for a microphone. A powerful person asks whether speaking will serve truth or serve attachment. Before you send the message, pause, not for 5 seconds, longer. Give yourself time to leave the emotional storm. The version of you who writes at midnight is not always the version of you who will respect the message in the morning. The version of you who feels rejected may not see clearly. The version of you who is lonely may confuse contact with healing. Wait 24 hours if possible. Write it somewhere else. Do not send it. Write the whole truth. Say the anger. Say the grief. Say the questions. Say the sentence you wish they had the maturity to hear. Then close it. Walk away. Return later. Ask, what do I actually want from this message? If the answer is, I want them to finally understand, be careful. If the answer is, I want them to feel guilty, be careful. If the answer is, I want them to give me peace, be careful. If the answer is, I want to see if they still care, be careful. Because now the message is not closure. It is dependence wearing formal clothes. Stoic discipline separates expression from exposure. You may need to express the pain. That does not mean you need to expose it to the person who mishandled it. You can write without sending. You can speak to someone wise. You can record your voice and delete it. You can walk until the emotional charge weakens. You can turn the message into a boundary rather than a plea. Not every truth needs an audience. Some truths need a spine. That is what this chapter is about. Not swallowing your voice. Not pretending you do not care. Not acting superior. Protecting the part of you that still wants to be met by someone who may not know how to meet anything honestly. Marcus Aurelius would warn that your mind becomes colored by what it repeatedly holds. If you keep returning your thoughts to the person who hurt you, preparing messages, arguments, explanations, confrontations, and emotional appeals, your inner life becomes colored by that attachment. You may call it closure. But your days are still shaped by them. Your attention is shaped by them. Your mood is shaped by them. Your sleep is shaped by them. Your self-worth is reacting to whether they answer. That is not freedom. Freedom is when you can feel the urge and not obey it. The urge rises, you notice it. You breathe, you do not worship it. You do not panic. You say, oh, this is the old attachment asking for access. And then you choose. That pause is where character is built. Character is built in private moments when no one would blame you for going backward, but you decide not to. Character is built when the message is written and you delete it. Character is built when you want to check their profile and you put the phone down. Character is built when your pride wants the last word, but your wisdom wants the last silence. Sometimes the paragraph is just another attempt to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. Sometimes the confrontation is another way to keep the bond alive. Sometimes the question is another hook. Sometimes the final message is not the end. It is the beginning of another loop. Ask yourself, if they do not answer, will I be okay? If they answer coldly, will I remain steady? If they twist my words, will I regret giving them access? If they respond warmly, will I become attached again? If this conversation creates more confusion, am I prepared to protect myself? If the answer is no, do not send it yet. Maybe do not send it at all. Your healing matters more than the temporary relief of being heard. There is a mature form of closure that does not need announcement. It does not need a dramatic goodbye. It does not need a final speech. It does not need to be witnessed by the person who caused the wound. It simply changes your behavior. You stop reaching. You stop explaining. You stop asking. You stop placing your emotional state in their hands. You stop returning to the same person expecting a different level of truth. That is closure in action. Not closure as a feeling. Closure as conduct. Practice the discipline of not sending the message, not because your words do not matter, because your peace matters more than placing your words in unsafe hands, not because the truth should never be spoken, because some truths are better lived than explained. The strongest message may be the one your life sends after you stop begging for closure. You continue. You rebuild. You become calm again. You become harder to manipulate. You become unavailable to old patterns. You become someone who no longer needs to knock on the same door to prove it was closed. And once you can do that, the next step becomes possible. You stop waiting for them to give you the ending. You begin giving it to yourself. Give yourself the closure. They were too weak to give you. This is the part nobody can do for you. Friends can remind you. Time can soften the sharp edges. Distance can help your nervous system breathe again. But there is a private decision only you can make, and no one can make it on your behalf. You have to decide that the missing apology is not going to become the missing life. At some point, you have to stop waiting for them to hand you the ending. This is where the pain becomes serious, because as long as you wait for closure from them, part of your life is still organized around their return, their apology, their honesty, their courage, their emotional maturity. You may not speak to them anymore. You may not see them anymore. You may not even want them back. But if your mind still says, I cannot fully move on until they explain, then they are still sitting in the center of your inner world. That is the part you must reclaim. Closure does not always arrive as a conversation. Sometimes it arrives as a decision you repeat until your nervous system starts believing you. A decision to stop waiting, a decision to stop checking, a decision to stop rehearsing, a decision to stop giving someone else's weakness the power to delay your peace, a decision to say, I did not receive what I deserved, but I will not let the absence of it become my prison. That is how you give yourself closure. Not by pretending it was fine, not by forcing yourself to feel healed before you are, not by saying you are over it when part of you is still tender, by creating an internal ending where the external one failed. You name what happened. You accept what it showed you. You remove the expectation that the other person must become honest before you can become free. You choose a boundary. You return to your life. Simple does not mean easy. The wounded mind keeps looking backward and saying, "But there should have been more." Yes, there should.